Thank you, Kay. Hi, everyone. Let's do a little sound check to make sure you can hear me. It never hurts. I keep getting a message saying I'm not the moderator, so I want to check with the team and make sure you know I'm on the Avicon avatar. And I want to thank you all for coming today and thank Barbara for that wonderful introduction. Barbara, Andy, and I work together at Virtual Harmony. We are all volunteers. And I've taught 52 university classes since 2005. Hey, thanks. And I'm still thumping my there we go. There we are in Virtual Harmony, and that's Andy and I standing there, and Barbara's in the image too, but she's doing the work, right? And and we use Virtual Harmony for everything from learning and simulations and games and you name it. We have 5 grids thanks to Andy's hard work. And my journeys began in Second Life with teaching in virtual worlds. And in fact, for this last class that I taught, we began right as the Virtual World's Best Practices in Education was ending. So I had them log into Second Life and go tour the exhibit posters over there before we went to, before we moved back to OpenSim. And here I am featured, and I'm catching up with my speakeasy in case you're wondering. And you know, one of the things I want to mention here is these kinds of worlds reinforce our belief in ourselves and in our students. We have to have fearless motivation, as Jane McGonigal would say, to be able to step into these worlds, use the Firestorm viewer, work with experts like Marcus Llewellyn, who fearlessly followed us around as we toured the hypergrid, right? And my students collected content, got ideas. These are just a few of the students, by the way. And in this set of slides, you're going to see quite a few student projects. Here's a few from cybersecurity where they took one of Andy Stricker's trivia games and turned it into a game simulation to look at security awareness, and then also wove that back into their doctoral research. So it's one of these notions that we can work together and we can strengthen the learning experience for students and for ourselves. You'll notice Barbara is still working with us, and she graduated in 2013. So here we are with a few other students, and what we would do each week is we would go through class and we would think about how to reinforce and strengthen not only the game challenge but also our own learning experience, reinforcing the concepts. Kay asked us to talk about what we get out of these kinds of experiences when it comes to teaching and learning. And one of the things I want to say is that it reinforces my commitment as an educator. I am so inspired by my students, whether they're undergraduates, graduate students, doctoral students. And one of my students was fascinated with movement, and he said, well, you know, you guys are animating textures, you're moving prims, you're doing stuff, but what would happen if I created a museum that reinforced the notion of movement without any movement? And so he created this Hall of Illusion on Virtual Harmony, and all of the images within it seem to move, whether you stand still, whether you move. And he was looking at all these different perspectives. And of course, I was very struck by his work in these spaces, because most of my students had no experience with the virtual world, right? No scripting experience, etc. They're all from other walks of life. Sometimes I get CEOs, I get folks who are fearful, right? They're in a doctoral program and they have this compelling need to do well, right? And of course, I'm going to let the speakeasy catch up with my slides here for a moment, because right now we're looking at the Hall of Illusion. Now we're in the Mobility and Dexterity project, and some of this is AI Austin's content. Many of you are familiar with the VCE. One of my students was fascinated with what can we do to support and strengthen the experience of accessibility, and not just in the sense of users who have the traditional labels of disabled, you know, by our government, if you will, but how about the rest of us, all of us who have at one time or another some mobility issue or some life issue, and what are our needs? And so he started looking at that and simulating these kinds of experiences. So I think of learning in these spaces as increasing a conversation about things that we don't often think about, right? Another student looked at scientific management, and he looked at pig iron ingots. How many of you know what pig irons are? Maybe everyone else does and I didn't, right? So when he first tells this to me, I'm going, pig irons, okay. And he says, and I want to simulate 1,100 of them. And I said, really? And of course I'm thinking to myself, that's not ideal in the virtual world, so tell me more. So he created these numbered stations, and he took images from history, and he looked at, this of course was Zalomar, and he looked at how to study productivity. And he also looked at scripting. So he looked at floating text, and he says, you know, the pivot point and where it's centered isn't ideal for some of the things I'm doing here. And so he studied how to strengthen that experience. This is just an aerial look at one of his displays. And then he saw that I love hats. I don't know if you noticed I'm wearing a hat today, right? And he says, well, we need a funny hat. We need a prize for playing all these games as a result of my class project, he said. So he created this hat, and it has these fun little pigs and irons hanging from it. I know it looks silly to the normal person, right? But for us, it was a treasure. And see those little Oompa Loompas on the slides there? They're the little guys in the red hats, and they go back and forth. He scripted them. So they go over to the pile of ingots, which of course are textured prims, right? With lots of ingots in it. And then they carry the ingot over to the railway car and drop it off. And so they spin around, and the other side's a little bit shaded, so you get this sense of distance and then coming at you. And they move so cute. And I was just enchanted with them. Anyway, he shows how productivity went up to 1,100 pigs in a day as opposed to 300. So how they could move 800 additional units, right? And so he simulates this here in this study. And of course the class had to tour it, play the game. We all had to win our hats. And these are just half of the class here. But it's just this notion that these spaces feed our imagination. They inspire us, and they make us think. Well, of course, some of my students were looking at robotics and the uncanny valley. Others were interested in brain synapses and thinking about neuroscience and thinking about what we can do with these games to really leverage how we think and feel about ourselves and our mental health. They used a variety, oops, I'm still talking about the ingots, aren't I? And well, here I had a student who decided, let's have a community center. Let's put up a pub and some meeting spaces, and then a bowling alley. And of course, then they start asking me, well, why can't I roll a ball down and play bowl, bowl like a traditional game? And so we started thinking about physics and thinking about all these behaviors and ways to simulate them as well. Well, so this is a fanciful place where we are explorers, and our goals is to provide students with opportunities for discovery. See, I don't think of the classroom as the next 10 to 15 weeks in which you learn the concepts, you pass the tests, and you move on. I think of it as part of a journey that doesn't stop. And I think that's where the value in virtual world learning is this is a very personal journey. Now, it also goes beyond the art of the possible, as Barbara had mentioned. You'll notice half of my class is up in the air, right? And of course, I make the ground, the platform space transparent, at least from the bottom, so we still get light through, and we still have this sense of connectedness, and we can see what each other are doing, that kind of thing. So we have these interesting ways of learning. Well, this is my final slide, and this is Barbara on the right and Andy on the left, and he put in a Stargate for me, of course, with Anubis, because I love World of Warcraft. I love all kinds of learning in all kinds of spaces, whether it's commercial games, whether it's virtual worlds. What's interesting is I'm no longer happy in other worlds now that I've been in OpenSim, because I not only have the power of creation, but the power of self-hosting and the power of control. And there's nothing headier as experiences go than being in charge and feeling like the creator, the guide, the instigator, the person who's willing to fail and to discover. Thank you.